Thank you. I'll just need to time myself because I will go over, because I'll be banging on about stuff. But well, thank you very much for having me here in Toronto. It's a wonderful city to come to. I'm just going to briefly tell you about some of the work that I'm involved with around concussion, mild traumatic brain injury through to moderate brain traumas. And as you're probably aware, the brain systems are there for a reason. You got your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere, and it's involved to do kind of two basic things, at a very basic level, to approach and to avoid. So I approached the food before I came here, and now you look quite approachable. I'm looking at your faces. You're quite approachable. Okay, good. So, so I can approach you with what I'm going to say next, rather than feel alarmed and need to run down to the nearest bar or something. So, approach and avoidance systems. Obviously, the brain's much more complicated than how this overhead might make you think, or one think. The brain is made up of about 87 billion neurons, and each neuron has about 10 to 30,000 connections, we think, at the very least. It's got axons kind of spreading around in all kinds of interesting kind of places. So the axons are like the telegraph wire, the telephone wires of the brain's microfilaments that connect up the brain. And so when you do anything, the brain is active, but lots of different parts of the brain are active when you're doing something. So now you're paying attention, so your frontal lobes are active, but also your temporal lobes are active because you're trying to remember what have I heard before about this kind of thing, and you're also visualizing something. Oh, that's what the brain looks like. It looks like a boxing glove or what have you. So, and these wonderful images are of the network that is the brain. So the brain is fantastically complex. Well, it keeps me on my toes in my job as a neuropsychologist anyway. It keeps me kind of surprised all the time. So this is a quick little graphic about how the brain changes over time. So we come into the world with most of our kind of neurons, but not in the right places. They migrate around, and by the time you're about 5, you've got 90% of what your brain's going to be in terms of its weight and all the rest of it. But it's still evolving and changing and sculpting itself. And there's 2 big waves of brain development. In the first 2-3 years, there's a big wave of development, and then in the teenage years, there's a big wave of development as well. So remember that in a minute. The first few years are incredibly important in brain development. Lots of connections being made between different parts of the brain being set up, and then later on in adolescence, there's huge amounts of development happening as well. So this is about development in adolescence period, particularly. So. This is important because we tend to find that, and I'll say more about this in a minute, that adolescence is a time of change, of turmoil, of excitement and adventure. Not for the parents, but for the kids, right? So it's an interesting time. So the brain goes through all these sort of changes. So when you're about 13, 14, a part of the brain matures. The part of the brain to do with wanting to be with whoever makes you feel excited to be in their company. Put it that way, right? Romantic love also kind of, Have you ever tried to explain to a 14-year-old what romantic love is and what lust is? Have you ever had that conversation? It's interesting being a parent, isn't it? Anyway, so I'll leave that aside. And please, nobody tweet what I've just said, or my kids will be on my case. Anyway, so the Mesolympic system, which is like your urges and all the rest of it, they kick in when you're 14, 15, 16, but your control systems aren't there yet. They're kind of making, is it a good idea to stay out on a Thursday night and you've got a heavy day at school the next day? No, it's not. Is it a good idea to have a pot party in your dad's house when he's off in South Africa doing some research? No, it's not. You'll get grounded for a long time. So, not thinking ahead, planning things through is a bit of an issue. Of course it is, because the world is so exciting at this point in life, because the brain at this point is very sensitive to reward, very sensitive to wanting stuff. And at this time also, the social brain is really evolving and developing because, of course, it's the social world that's so important to us as human beings. Anyway, so when traumatic brain injury happens, it happens far too regularly, and it's the biggest cause of death and disability worldwide in kids and in young people. Biggest cause of death and disability in children and young people up to age 40. As we go here, a few images of brain trauma. Moderate severe brain injury, that's when you've been knocked out for a period of time, 20 minutes or more. Mild forms of brain injury could be up to 20 minutes, but that's not mild, is it? And then some concussions can be quite significant, and they're not So most people recover from minor brain disturbance, that is concussion, but not always. So maybe 1 in 10 with ongoing sequelae from that. So when the brain gets injured, it moves around. If, for example, one of my patients I'm thinking of, hit by a baseball bat across the head, falls to the ground, brain moves around inside the skull. Because the head is hit over here, there's pressure waves against this part of the brain on the inside of the skull, but also the brain has hit the other side of the skull on the other side, contractile injury. And as the brain is moving inside the skull, there's tearing of those wonderful filaments, those axons that connect with the brain. So they can either be compromised in that they won't transmit the electrical impulses so well anymore, or they may shear. And so the connections are degraded to some extent, which is a bit of a problem. And often it's in the areas of the frontal part of the brain, and the frontal part of the brain is, as I was saying before, important for thinking ahead, planning things out, holding yourself in, not saying something that might be silly or taken as being inappropriate or lacking judgment, and so on. In the UK, we've been doing research over quite a few years now, and one of the key areas that we've been looking at is when are people more likely to have injuries. So classically, kids, young men between 14 and 24 are very prone to having injuries. They're out, they're about, they're having their adventures, they may get involved in a fight, they might fall down drunk, they might drive too fast, they may be involved in sports, all the rest of it. So that's, life is brisk to some extent. But if you looked over here, we also found that 3-year-olds, when they're starting to toddle, they're starting to wander about the place, they're also more likely to fall over things. And so if they're very young, they're also at risk of having head injuries. What we particularly found in one study is that children from the most deprived communities, the poorest 5% community in our society, were 5 times more likely, if they were under 5, to have a head injury. 5 times more likely. So there's something we need to do to try to protect these young brains from having more injuries. Good public transport is important. More good public transport equals less head injuries, for example. So what can happen after a head injury? Well, development may be delayed a bit, but recovery happens. There could be a reduced trajectory, so not going to get back to what you could have been and cognitively, or there could be a plateau, or there could be a decline. So we found what a big area of research I've been doing the last few years. When I moved on from working as a neuropsychologist to people with traumatic brain injury, getting back to work, improving their family life and all the rest of it, I started working with people who ended up in prisons because we were wondering how many people in prison may have had a head injury. In general society, it's about 10%. In prisons, it turns out that about 60% of people in prison have had a head injury, and usually when they were young. And usually, they ended up being excluded from schools because they had attention problems, concentration problems, they weren't very good at getting along with other people, and they started to drift away out of schools. And in the UK, what we find is that drug gangs make use of them. And other kind of gangs use them for stealing and all the rest of it. So they become prey. They become very vulnerable. So we find, when you do an economic analysis, that a cost of a head injury, typically in the UK, on average, is about £95,000. But because there's such a risk of kids becoming vulnerable to ending up in the criminal justice system, which is very expensive, it costs £600 a night for a kid to be kept in a juvenile delinquent centre in the UK. A lot of money. That's very expensive, isn't it? Compare that to a nice hotel in Canada, in Toronto. It's a lot of money, isn't it? I prefer to have them in a nice hotel in Toronto. Anyway, so the costs are enormous. If they get involved in crime, it adds another about £250,000 per case. Anyway, so we've been making the case to our government that earlier, better neurorehabilitation for kids to keep them in school is important, but also any kids and young people who have brain trauma, we can try to reduce the chances of depression, suicidality, anxiety disorders through better, earlier integration and rehabilitation. And just three weeks ago, the United Nations updated their Convention on the Rights of the Child to take account of there's far too many kids with autism, ADHD, and brain trauma in our criminal justice systems because they've been failed by our education systems and shouldn't be there. So children most likely to get TBIs, are least likely to get support. We need more school support, more liaison diversion, more support for parents, and better screening and rehabilitation. Thank you.